Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil mursaleen Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. To all listeners of Radio Al Ansar, I'd like to welcome you to another segment of Zidni Ilma. And this is a show where we try to increase our knowledge that's going to be beneficial, that's going to be practical, that's going to assist us in our daily lives, that's going to assist us, it's going to assist the community as well. And my name is Ismail Moosa, and today I'm going to be your host for this segment, and we're going to be discussing atheism, and more specifically we're going to be talking about deconstructing atheism. And inshallah, this is going to be a really interesting topic. It's going to be something that many of us will be able to relate to. Many of us might feel that it's pertinent. It's going to be engaging, inshallah. But at the same time, I'd like to also just put out a disclaimer that certain topics will be a bit technical. So, you just need to be concentrating, you just need to be focusing, you need to have your thinking caps on, and inshallah it will be extremely, extremely beneficial. So, an overview of what we're going to discuss today, so we all have an idea of what's coming, is that we're going to start off with discussing the causes or the reasons for the proliferation of atheism in the world in the last few decades. So we're going to study the cause. Then we're going to move into the definitions and the pertinent terms that we need to know. After that, we're going to discuss something called the burden of proof. And don't worry if you don't know what that means yet. We're going to explain what it is and why it's relevant. Then we're going to move on to the most important topic of tonight's discussion, and that is epistemology. And epistemology simply means what constitutes legitimate proof. How do I get to know something? What's a credible way of me coming to know about the world around me? And I may spend a minute or two talking about the arguments that we can use. And finally, if there is time, we're going to discuss morality and whether or not an atheist has a claim to objective morality. And that's a really, really interesting and extremely pertinent topic. Because, anyone who's on social media has seen perhaps countless times an atheist objecting to something within the Islamic paradigm, calling it immoral or, calling it all sorts of terms. Whereas the fact is that they have no real claim to objective morality and thus cannot term something moral or immoral. But again, if there is time, inshallah, we're going to discuss that right at the end. Now, when it comes to something that's so widespread and so broad as atheism, many people, for lack of a better word, naively or simply think that since the point of contention between a Muslim or a theist and an atheist is the fact that the one believes in the existence of a creator and the other doesn't, so a person naturally feels like the best solution to all of this is to simply chalk up 5 or 10 good arguments, solid arguments for the existence of a creator, and then, so to say, throw it at the atheist and you solved, your problem is gone. But in reality, that's a very shallow and it's not a very forward-thinking way of approaching the matter. Because the reality is this, that whenever there's a new ideology, whenever there's a new movement, whenever there's, people flocking to a certain line of thinking, in order to properly combat it, you've got to understand where they're coming from, why they're saying what they're saying, what are the premises that their worldview is based upon, what has led them to take this stance. And only in doing this will you be able to truly unravel this ideology and fully understand what they're saying, why they're saying it, and how to tackle it. And so that's the approach that we're going to be taking tonight, inshallah. So tonight's session, if you were expecting certain arguments against atheism or arguments to prove that there's a God, then you're going to be disappointed, because I may spend a few minutes just outlining the different arguments, but we're not going to go into that. We're going to go into what I like to call the argument before the argument. And that is where we discuss what constitutes legitimate proof, who needs to prove what. Because, and I think everyone listening here today understands that if I go up to an atheist and I want to prove to him that God exists, I can't show him a verse in the Quran and say, see, the Quran says that Allah exists and Allah created the worlds, therefore you should believe this. Because obviously in his mind, this doesn't constitute legitimate proof because it's not an authority for him. So similarly, many of the arguments that we might feel will be compelling will be ruled out by this person because he has a very different way of viewing the world. And there's a whole argument that needs to be had regarding what constitutes legitimate proof. How do we get to know something? And only once this argument has been fully discussed in detail, then can we go on to making an actual case for the existence of a creator. So this is something we need to understand, and this was the way of the ulama of the past. If you look at people like Imam Ghazali rahimahullah, before he wrote his Tahafutul Falasifa, he showed via his writings that he had understood the ideologies that they were propagating. He was able to articulate them just as well as they would be able to articulate them. So that brings us on to my next point, which is that whenever we're responding to a deviant sect, whenever we're trying to prove something about Islam, we should never labor under the misconception that we're doing this from a vacuum, that, we are the first people to talk about this. No, we have 1,400 years of scholarship behind us. We have, especially in today's topic about atheism, we have scholars from different backgrounds, Muslim scholars, great scholars who have written on these topics, who have written about epistemology, who have written about how to prove that there is a creator. And they've done a fantastic job in building a framework, a solid framework that we can use and we can build upon ourselves. So perhaps they may not have discussed certain modern novel ideologies like evolution, for example, but they definitely did build a solid enough framework that we can then use to counter any ideology, whether they discussed it explicitly or not. So again, my point is, it's not right for us as Muslims to simply, pull any answer out of our back pocket or to say this or that without consulting or without at least reading through the scholarship and what the ulama of Islam have already produced on the topic. And this is something that I want to stress throughout tonight's talk, that the ulama have discussed these things which we feel maybe are modern and new concepts. They've discussed them in detail in the books of the past. And the last point before we actually begin is that the advantage of studying a movement by, looking beyond the surface and looking at their premises and the lines of thinking that they employ, the benefit of this is that obviously it does help you to deal with the deviant members of this group, as it were. But at the same time, it also helps us to identify dangerous thoughts, dangerous ideologies, dangerous lines of thinking that may even be present amongst a very practicing Muslim person, someone who, alhamdulillah, his aqidah is fine, he's reading his 5 daily salah, etc. But he has a certain way of viewing the world, and unconsciously, without even realizing it, he doesn't know that this way of viewing the world is dangerous. It can lead to dangerous things in the future. So in order for us to rectify our own understanding of the world, sometimes it's very helpful to break things down like the way we are going to do it tonight, inshallah. So let's begin with the first, so to say, topic of discussion, and that is the reasons for the proliferation of atheism. So I think it would be really simplistic to claim that there's only one reason, and that it's not actually an accumulation of multiple reasons. But we're going to look at one reason only for tonight, and we're going to deal with how to solve that problem based on this reason. So the reason that I have identified, and many others besides me, is basically the advancements in the many fields that science has contributed to. And this is a good thing. As Muslims, we really appreciate the advancements in science, the advancements in technology, the advancements in the, in medicine, and all of these things that have helped humanity to a great extent. No one's against that. No one's denouncing that. No one's saying that's a bad thing. But as a corollary of those advancements and those discoveries, certain things have occurred. So the first thing is that, and this is, mainly in the Christian world, in America and in Europe, where science discovered many things that went contradictory to the Bible, or at the very least went contradictory to how many people interpreted the Bible, if we're going to be generous with our terms here. And so this led to people in the West beginning to think that, there's a great divide and there's opposition between science and religion. And this was a category error in the sense that they conflated Christianity with religion as a whole. So people by and large began to feel that if I am going to accept science, which it seems like I should do because science is advancing, is discovering so many things, there's so many achievements that they've made, then I have to by necessity denounce my religion. And this led to a great influx from religious groups into atheism. But of course we know as Muslims that this sort of problem doesn't occur in Islam. It doesn't occur with the Quran and the Hadith, because there can never be anything in the Quran and in the authentic Hadith that will go directly against something that has been definitively proven in science. So while this might not have been directly related to Islam as such, it definitely led to an increase in atheism. Now the second thing that happened when science progressed in the way that it did, and when it began to discover, the minute things of this world, like bacteria, viruses, the cells in the body, and even the amazing things in the universe, like the other stars and the planets and things like that, when science began to discover these things and prove beyond doubt that their conclusions were true in certain aspects, then people began to place their full reliance on the scientific method and whatever science has to output. Now again, I'm going to state this, and perhaps I'm going to state this more than once throughout the session tonight. We're not against the scientific progress, but we're saying that when people began to place all of their reliance on the scientific method, and they began to feel that the only way I can really get to know something is via the scientific method, this already put them into a contradiction. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator, is above being tested, is above, the tangible universe, is over and above this. And science and the scientific method deals with the tangible universe that we can see, touch, taste, experiment on, and do tests on. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above and beyond this. So therefore, if the only way you can get to know something is via the scientific method, then your way of getting to know things is not going to allow you to recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that is a trap that many people have unwittingly fell into when they began to rely too much on the scientific method as a means for knowledge. And that's something we're going to be talking about a little bit later, that how do we get to know something and what are the legitimate means for knowledge? Is it only restricted to the scientific method, or is it more vast than that? And as we'll see, the ulama of Islam have discussed this topic in detail. So basically understanding that the advancements of science, which were a good thing, came with certain negative things, such as people seeing a divide between religion and science, and people placing their full trust on the scientific method to give them ilm and knowledge. Then we understand, so to say, where this great influx of atheism is coming from. And it's something we need to understand, that just taking one survey that was done in America in about the 1950s, about 1% of people identified as religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, meaning people who don't identify with any religion. And when they looked at that in the 2000s, in the 21st century, it had already increased to over 20%. So this is an exponential increase that we're seeing, and we need to understand some of the reasons behind this, one of which we've just discussed. So keeping that in the back of our mind, let's now move directly into the topic. So quickly, we just want to clarify a few terms. What do we mean technically when we say atheist? So what we mean is an atheist is someone who, by definition, is making a positive claim, or is making a claim, and he's asserting that no God exists. He's saying, I believe this statement and I assert that no God exists. Now, this is different from an agnostic person who's simply saying, I don't know. In his mind, he's saying there's not enough evidence for me, and therefore I don't believe in a God, but neither do I believe that there's no God. I'm basically agnostic on this point. An atheist, on the other end of the spectrum, such as us, we would say that, you know what, we are making a positive claim. We are asserting that a God exists. So those are the definitions. It's nothing complicated. but it is of some importance. And why it's of some importance is when we move on to our next topic, which is the burden of proof. The burden of proof means that in a dispute or in an argument or in a debate between two parties on a particular point, who has to provide the proof for their claim? So generally, and it's accepted, and in Hanafi fiqh, and it's a hadith as well, al-bayyinatu ala al-mudda'i, that the person who is making the claim needs to provide the proof. So if we are based on that general principle, if I am talking to an agnostic, he's not making any claims. He's simply saying, you know what, I don't know whether God exists, I don't know. If you can prove it to me, I'll accept it. Whereas we, as Muslims, alhamdulillah, we are making a positive claim. We are saying definitely, we are asserting that a God does exist. So based on that, it would mean that when this discussion or debate takes place, the burden of proof is on our shoulders by the general standards. Now we're going to discuss whether that's necessarily the case just now. On the contrary, if I'm talking to an atheist is someone who is claiming that no God exists. So just like I need to provide proof for my claim, so too does the atheist need to provide proof because he is making a claim. And anyone who's making a claim in the dispute or the debate needs to provide proof. So whilst you'll assume, that there's so many atheists, when you really meet them and you really talk to them and you really discuss with them, you'll realize that they're not actually atheists. They're actually agnostics. And perhaps some of them just play the agnostic card so that they don't have to shoulder the burden of proof, whatever the case is. But generally, by and large, 90 to 95% of the time, when you do discuss with someone who says they don't believe in a religion or believe in God, na'udhu billahi min dhalik, then you will find that this person will be an agnostic. So for all intents and purposes, in the rest of today's session, we are talking about an agnostic person, someone who says, well, I don't know. And as the general principle does go, in a case like that, the burden of proof is upon the person who's making the claim, and that is us. Now, when approaching this sort of discussion and this sort of debate, and you're talking, we have a Muslim here, and he's discussing with someone who is, in inverted commas, an atheist, but in reality, he's an agnostic. So what are the sort of steps that a Muslim could take in this sort of confrontation or in this sort of debate or discussion and this face-to-face dialogue? So I'm going to outline 4 steps that a person can take. The first is going to be that one which is, not advised, something you shouldn't be doing. And the other 3 are going to be legitimate academic ways that you could take. So the first thing that a person can do, and unfortunately many people do sort of fall into this, is that when they discuss with an agnostic, they'll tell him, well, you saying that there's no God, so you need to provide proof for your claim. Now that's not a very academic thing to say, that's not a very accurate thing to say. So it's something that we should all avoid. That's not the way we should go to do this, and that we should go about this, and we should really avoid that type of reasoning. Now let's look at 2 other ways in which we could shift the burden of proof that are legitimate, that are academic, that make sense, and inshallah they can be beneficial. So this first way of shifting the burden of proof is where we appeal to something called self-evident truths. So we tell this agnostic person that, yes, I agree with you, the burden of proof is generally upon the person who is making the claim. However, that is not what we'd call a qaida kulliya. It's not something that applies across the board. Rather, it only applies when we're not talking about self-evident truths. So what do you mean by self-evident truths? An example of a self-evident truth would be the fact that I exist and you exist and all the listeners tonight exist. And while it's technically possible that we could all be hooked up to computers, our brains could be hooked up to computers, and they could be feeding us the information we're seeing, and none of this really exists. It's technically a possibility. Yet if someone were to say that, I don't believe this, I don't believe the world is real, we wouldn't need to prove anything to him because he's going against a self-evident truth. Another example of this, very similar to that, is, the fact that the past itself even exists. Like, it's possible that someone just injected those memories into our brains. We can't really prove that the past actually happened. It's only stored in our memories. That's the only place where it's really stored. So how do we prove that it really happened? Imagine we had a court case, and someone went into someone's house and he stole something, and now he's being taken to court, and he tells the judge, well, you know what, I don't know whether the past existed. I don't know if we even exist. And if you want to charge me, then you need to prove to me that we exist and the past exists, and then only you can charge me. Now, obviously, no one's going to listen to a word he's saying. It's going to sound ridiculous. It's going to sound like this person's gone crazy. Even though technically what he's saying fits with the qaida, with the rule that the person who is making a claim, which is us, we're saying we really exist and the past exists, needs to bring proof. But when it comes to a self-evident truth, like the fact that we exist or the past exists, then you don't need to bring proof. In fact, the person who doesn't believe it, he needs to bring proof. So this person, although it's impossible, would need to bring proof that the past doesn't exist. Why? Because it's a self-evident truth. So we can reason like this and say, you know what, the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a self-evident truth. If we look throughout history, if we look at all of the civilizations, every single one of them at the very least recognized that there was a creator for the entire universe, and none of them believed that the universe, well, barring one or two, none of them really believed that the entire universe sustained itself or things like that. So we can use this to try and shift the burden of proof by claiming that the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the existence of God, is a self-evident truth. And scholars in the past, like Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, using the fitrah argument, have attempted to do a certain thing. However, I'd like to just make a disclaimer here, and I'd like to point out that it may be a bit difficult to define what's a self-evident truth. So, I mean, everyone might accept that our existence or the existence of the past, those are self-evident truths. But now, how do we really make parameters for this? How do we define it? How do we decide what is a self-evident truth, what's not a self-evident truth? So you may run into problems if you try to shift the burden of proof using this sort of thinking. However, it is valuable. It does provide a lot of benefit in the sense that it shows the atheist or the agnostic in this case that, you know what, this is not something that applies across the board, that every time someone is claiming something, he has to bring proof. It's not true under all circumstances, and this is something that he needs to understand. Now, the second way in which we can attempt to shift the burden of proof is, and this is something that I prefer personally, is where we tell the agnostic or we tell the atheist that, see, I accept that the person who is making the claim needs to provide the proof. He needs to bring evidence. However, that is if and only if there are multiple options and there are other alternatives to what he's claiming. So what do we mean by that? Let's just explain by way of an example, and this is an example that atheists love using to show who the burden of proof is on. So let's imagine there's a coin toss going on in one room. And in the other room, you have Mr. A and Mr. B, and they're informed that this coin toss has taken place. And Mr. A says, well, you know what, I think it landed on tails. And Mr. B says, I don't know, I don't have enough evidence, I wasn't in the room, I didn't see the coin toss, I can't just make a random discussion. So I can't just make, a random decision when it comes to that. Now, what the atheists will generally say at that point is that, see, Mr. A is like you, the theist. He's making a claim. And I am Mr. B in this situation. I don't know whether it landed on heads or tails. So you need to bring proof to me and prove to me which one it actually landed on, and then I'll believe you, no problem. So we just want to twist the example a bit here. So imagine the example is the same. You got a coin toss going on in one room, and you got these two men in the other room, Mr. A and Mr. B. And this time the difference is that the coin has tails on both sides. And now when the person tosses the coin lands on the floor. And Mr. A says, well, it's going to be tails, because there's tails on both sides. And Mr. B says, no, I'm not sure, I don't know, you need to prove to me. Now in that case, no one needs to prove anything to Mr. B unless he can show that there's a legitimate alternative, because the only option is that the coin landed on tails. There's no other option. So Mr. B could say, well, what if it landed on its side, or what if it never fell down, or something ludicrous. If he could put up an alternative point, or if he could show that there is another possible alternative, then the burden of proof would be on Mr. A. So if we have to transfer that now to our discussion, we are talking to an agnostic person and we are telling him that the universe here, it exists, there must be a reason for its existence, and we believe that the reason for its existence is an omnipotent, all-knowing creator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, if he can't provide one legitimate alternative to the suggestion that we are making, then definitely, without doubt, there's no burden of proof on our shoulders, because this is the only alternative. This is the only solution. If he were, for example, to say, well, what if the universe just always existed? What if it all, and this is just the case, there doesn't need to be a creator. Then we can say, well, an infinite regress, and we can go into the arguments after that. We can knock that possibility out of the park, and then there would remain only one possibility, and again the burden of proof would not be on our shoulders. So if we understood this correctly, then this is a very, it's a very effective way we can use to shift the burden of proof to an extent onto the shoulders of the agnostic or the atheist. So that's got to do with the burden of proof, and we spoke about 3 different methods. The first is the incorrect one, where you ask him to bring proof even though he's not making a claim. That's incorrect, it's not academic. The second method is where you claim that the existence of God is a self-evident truth, and like many self-evident truths, no one needs to bring proof for them. The third one is where you say, yes, I will accept the burden of proof if and only if you can provide another alternative for what I am saying. And the fourth method in this whole thing is where we actually go about proving, using proofs, using arguments, we go about proving the existence of a creator. And that's what we're going into now. So now it's time for us to discuss perhaps the most important topic for tonight, and that is the topic of epistemology. Because before we bring any proof to the table, and again, epistemology just means what is a legitimate source of knowledge? How do I get to know things? What counts as a proof? What doesn't count as a proof? So, because before we present our proof to the atheist, we need to be on the same page with respect to what's legitimate and what isn't. And that is where this topic of epistemology becomes so important. Now, the ulama of ilmul kalam, the ulama of mantiq, and many other scholars in the past, classical scholars, have dealt with this topic in detail. How does a person get to know something? And basically, they've narrowed it down to 3 sources of knowledge. And this is something that almost all ulama have all agreed upon, that there are 3 ways that we can get to know things. The first is through our 5 senses. So I see something, I know it exists. So I'm looking at this mic in front of me, and I'm like 100% sure that this mic exists and that it's probably black and it's shaped the way I'm seeing it. So our 5 senses are a way of getting knowledge. The second way in which we can gain knowledge is using our rational faculty. So I can know without looking at anything that if I take 5 objects and add another 5 objects to them, there'll be 10 objects there. Rationally, I can understand that without any prior empirical evidence. Rationally, I know that it's impossible for there to be a square circle. I can know a lot of things rationally without even conducting any scientific experiments, without even looking at anything. Just purely from my mind, I can understand certain things, and this is the rational faculty. The third, and this is the most important source of knowledge for our discussion today, the third way we can get to know something is via eyewitness testimony. So, example, Allah protect us, but example, a building near your house burnt down, and you weren't there, you were at work, and 10 different neighbors of yours phoned you and told you that, the building that's near your house, it burnt down. And when 10 of them, one after the other, phoned and told you this, you got certain knowledge and you understood that the building definitely burnt down, because there's no way they could have co-conspired like that. There's no way that they could have coincidentally said the same thing. So you got certain knowledge that the building burnt down, just as you would have had, or almost on the same level as you would have had if you saw it burning down yourself. And this is a very, very fundamental source of knowledge for a Muslim Muslim, because the hadith have been transmitted to us via eyewitness testimony and then chains of narration. The Quran has come down to us in what we call a mutawatir fashion. Mutawatir means mass transmission, that so many people heard it from Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who transmitted it to so many others, and the chain continued until it reached us. We know that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam did miracles, even though we never saw those miracles except for the Quran. The rest of the miracles of Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we believe in them. Why? Because they were transmitted to us via people who saw them with their own eyes. And this is a valid and legitimate source of knowledge. And many people today, when it comes to the discussion about God, to the discussion about prophets, they don't seem to accept this source of knowledge for some reason or the other. And we're going to get into that discussion just now. Now, there's another source of knowledge that the ulama have discussed, which is a combination of your five senses and your rational faculty. And that is what the ulama called mujarrabat, and it's basically a rudimentary version of the scientific method. So what is mujarrabat? Mujarrabat means things that have been tried and tested. So as a very basic example, I know that if I'm holding this bottle now in front of me, if I drop it, I know it's going to fall. But how do I know that? I know that because in the past, whenever I dropped something, and in the past, whenever anyone in this world has ever dropped something, it fell. Therefore, I formulated a comprehensive statement from this, which is that any time I drop something, it will fall. So that is what we call mujarrabat, where how do I know that the bottle is going to fall? I haven't seen it falling. All I've seen are past events that happened, and using my rational faculty, I can understand that if that's how it went in the past, it's probably going to carry on like that in the future, and therefore the bottle is probably going to fall when I drop it. So that is the source of knowledge called mujarrabat, which basically is the underpinnings of the scientific method. Another example of mujarrabat would be when doctors or pharmacists test a medication. So they take 100 people who have a certain sickness, and they test this medication on these 100 people. And perhaps this medication works on these 100 people only. They've only observed it on these 100 people. But then they make a broad statement that this medicine cures this sickness. So mujarrabat, according to the ulama, gives you a certain level of certainty. Yes, you can be, if it's something that's tested a billion times, like the fact that fire burns, it gives you 99% certainty that fire will burn. And if it's something that you've only tested on 100 people, like that medication, maybe it'll give you 80% certainty. But at no point will it ever give you 100% certainty, because we know that these laws of nature, the things that are going on, the things that generally happen, are things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can break at any time. And that is why when Ibrahim alayhi salam went into the fire did not burn him. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can choose and not to give the fire its ability to burn. And therefore, even though, we know that we know quite certainly that if I drop something, it's going to fall, it's not 100% certainty. Therefore, it's part of Iman to believe that the natural laws can be broken by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they have been broken by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, this is a basic reconstruction of what the ulama of Islam have discussed regarding sources of knowledge. And if we are going to get into a discussion with an agnostic or an atheist, then what sort of epistemology will he have? So we know as Muslims, we accept our five senses, we accept our rational faculty, we accept eyewitness testimony, we accept the scientific method which tries and tests things till you come to a certain conclusion. We accept that, although not on such a high level. But when you discuss with people who are agnostics or atheists, what sort of epistemology are you likely to encounter? And so here are four things that an agnostic is likely to believe when you discuss with him. And we're going to discuss how to basically dismantle these four statements. So the first is, he's likely to believe that the scientific method is the only way of getting to truth. So he's going to discount rationality. So the first thing he's going to believe is that the only way to get to truth is via the scientific method. The second thing he's going to believe is that other ways or sources of knowledge like rationality or eyewitness testimony don't really give you any truth. You can't base your beliefs on that. The third thing he's going to claim is that, and these are very extreme people that make this third claim, is that whatever science gives us is true. And that's a very extreme claim on the face of it, but we're going to discuss that. And the last thing which he's going to believe is that the natural laws are immutable. So what does this mean? It means that the law of gravity, the law of thermodynamics, Newton's law, basically in simple terms, the fact that the fire burns, the fact that the knife cuts, the fact that if I drop something it falls, all of these are immutable, they can never be broken. And therefore he's going to already discount miracles. Because what is a miracle? A miracle is basically a cessation. It's a cessation of the natural laws, and it's a breaking of the natural laws. And this is something that if a person has this understanding, he's already going to discount miracles. So those were 4 things that I've identified that you're likely to identify, that you're likely to come across in an agnostic. Number 1, he believes the only way to truth is the scientific method. Number 2, he believes that all other ways of getting to the truth, should be discounted, and they have no real place in our epistemology, and those two are very linked. The other thing is he may believe is that whatever science says is true, and the last thing he'll believe is that the natural laws are immutable. So we need to discuss these quickly, and we've only got about 10 minutes left, but inshallah we can cover these statements. So his first statement, which is that the only way to get to truth is via the scientific method. This is a claim that they make, and this is something that they use quite often. So it's a very weak statement. Why is that? Because your claim that the only way we can prove something is via the scientific method, how do you prove this claim? That's the first thing we'd want to ask him. Can you prove your claim via the scientific method? Can you test it? And again, we've alluded to what the scientific method is. It's where you have a hypothesis, you test something a few times, and then you come to a conclusion, like with the example with a medication, or things like that. If you join these two elements, then this reaction occurs. Because you've done it in a lab so many times, you have certainty that it's going to occur. So agnostics believe that, the scientific method is the only way to the truth, but how do they prove that claim? They would have to use logical reasoning. They would have to resort to all sorts of other proofs to even prove this claim of theirs in the first place. So this claim is what we would call a self-defeating claim, that it can never be proved by itself, and the statement in and of itself is contradictory. The second thing that we'd want to discuss is, if the only way to truth is the scientific method as you claim, then how do you even get to know anything about history? How do you access the past? Because all of our stories about history and the different empires and things that occurred in the past come from eyewitness testimony. People wrote biographies, people engraved certain things here and there that we can look at. And from these writings, we were able to reconstruct the past to a certain extent. We rely almost solely on eyewitness testimony to know what happened in the past. If you're going to discuss that, if you're going to discount that, should we rather just discount the subject of history altogether? What about geography? If you haven't visited another country, how do you know it exists? This person might say, I've seen pictures of that place. That's how I know it exists. Well, how do you know that picture was actually of that place? Because someone told you, So, again, eyewitness testimony is key to anyone's life. It's key to accessing history. It's key to accessing geographical places that you've never been to. And the nail in the coffin in all of this is where you'd want to ask the agnostic, and it's obviously not an offensive question, is that how do you know that your parents are your parents? I mean, did you do a DNA test, or was it simply the fact that they told you, that your relatives told you this is your parents? And so you accepted the eyewitness testimony, you accepted the repercussions that came along with that, in the sense that you love these people, you cherish them, you listen to what they say, if they are hurt, it hurts you. All of these things you accepted based purely on eyewitness testimony. And this is the point I want to make quickly, is that there's a lot of double standards that occurs whenever you're discussing with an atheist or an agnostic. So in his everyday life, he is all too happy to accept eyewitness testimony. He'll do it when someone tells him the weather is bad somewhere, and then he'll carry his jacket. He'll do it when people tell him that, you know what, these are your parents, and he'll accept the consequences of that as well. But when we come to talking about God, when we talk about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the miracles of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, all of a sudden eyewitness testimony goes out of the window and he doesn't accept it. Similarly, atheists in their everyday life, they don't need a proof to be 100% before they accept it. If someone told them there's a 70-80% chance of rain, they will accept that and they'll act accordingly. If someone told them that, you know what, it's likely to be traffic here because I just passed here, they will accept that and they will act accordingly. But now when we come with an extremely strong proof for the existence of God, they'll say, but what if, it's possible that it could be like this, so your proof is not 100%, it's 99.999%, and therefore I'm not going to accept it. So that's a double standards. And therefore we can see that the atheist mindset is in complete contradiction with his entire life, because when he engages in these discussions, he uses a standard that he doesn't use for the rest of his life. So within himself there is an internal contradiction. So clearly from this here we can see that, you know what, eyewitness testimony is a source of knowledge. If it isn't, then these people really shouldn't know who their parents are unless they've done a DNA test and compared the DNA, and even then too it's still subject to some sort of error. Now the third belief that you could run into, which we discussed, is that the person might claim that whatever science says is going to be 100% correct. And this is, of course, a very extreme claim. We as Muslims, we are not against science. We don't have anything against it per se, but we understand that the conclusions that science comes to is of different levels. So certain things scientists have seen with their eyes, like the cells in our body. Certain things they've witnessed in the universe. They've seen the different planets. They've seen that they're round. They've seen all of these things. Certain things they've basically tested in the lab, and they understand that if you join these two elements, you get this. So these sort of things we accept as Muslims. They're likely to be true, especially those things that they saw with their own eyes. We accept these. These are quite certain conclusions that they've come to. But at the same time, there are many theories that are just purely conjecture, like, the dark matter or string theory. And, there's websites on the internet, you can search for them, which document all of the theories that scientists had over the last 50 or 60 years, and how each one of them was proved wrong one after the other. So again, we don't keep a list of this because we're trying to show that science is bad or we're against it. We keep this list because we want to show the person that, not everything science says is going to be 100% correct. And it's very important to be able to convince people of this. And the last thing that we want to talk about today is the natural laws, and the fact that many people believe that the natural laws are immutable. So again, when we look at the scientific method and when we test something over and over again in the lab, this is something that's known as inductive reasoning. So what is inductive reasoning? Inductive reasoning is where a person, and this is a famous example, a hypothetical example, where a person wants to find out what is the color or what is the color of a swan. And so he goes outside, he counts all of the swans he can see for months on end. Every single swan he finds is white. And so he comes to the conclusion that, swans are white. And he's 100% convinced. But the next morning he wakes up and he sees another swan, and this one is black. And so his entire conclusion crumbles to the ground. And this is the nature of inductive reasoning. When we do scientific experiments in the lab and it works on 100 people, on 1,000 people, and then we make the claim from that, we extrapolate and say, no, this medication can cure this sickness in totality. This is inductive reasoning, and it's not something that's 100% correct. And similarly, the natural laws that we see around us, gravity, etc., just because they've existed like this for the last 200 years or 4,000 years or 200,000 years, it doesn't mean that they will exist like this in the future or that they have in the past. So using things like this, we can explain to people that, these sort of things are not definitive. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can break the natural laws whenever He wills, and the natural laws being immutable is only inductive reasoning, and it's not something that we subscribe to at all as a Muslim. So inshallah, that's all we have time for today, and there may be a round 2 of this if people want to hear more about it. But we will stop there for today, and that's it for Zidni Ilma. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.